in the affluent, predominantly white neighborhood of Fairview Hills, Georgia. Jamal Hayes, a successful black entrepreneur, moves in only to face relentless discrimination from the HOA president, Margaret Lawson. As Margaret harasses Jamal with unfair violations and passive-aggressive behavior, tensions escalate. But when Jamal reveals he's the owner of Margaret's home, bought through her own financial mistakes, the tables are turned. Will Margaret's power crumble? How far will Jamal go to fight back? Tune in to discover the shocking twists. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Voices of the Underdog for more incredible stories. Jamal Hayes sat in his sleek black SUV, the engine humming softly as he pulled into the long driveway of his new home in Fairview Hills, Georgia. The neighborhood was everything he had worked for: grand, tree-lined streets, neatly manicured lawns, and stately homes with pristine facades. The house he had purchased, a modern two-story beauty with large glass windows and a spacious porch, stood as a testament to his years of dedication and hard work. As he stepped out of the car, taking in the fresh air, he felt something, a presence, a weight in the atmosphere. It wasn't excitement or curiosity from friendly neighbors, but something heavier. Eyes, peering from behind lace curtains, lingering glances from people walking their dogs. A woman across the street, dressed in tennis whites, paused mid-conversation on her phone to give him a long, unreadable look. Jamal sighed. He had dealt with this before. The quiet judgment. The unspoken questions: who is he? What is he doing here? Does he belong? With a determined shake of his head, he dismissed the feeling and focused on the task at hand. Moving boxes lined the driveway, and a large moving truck idled near the curb. His best friend, Reggie, a burly ex-college linebacker, leaned against the truck, sipping from a bottle of water. "Man, I thought moving up meant getting away from all the nosy folks," Reggie joked, nodding toward the neighbors who had quickly turned away the moment Jamal glanced in their direction. Jamal chuckled but didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed a box labeled office supplies and started toward the house. Just as he reached the porch, a sharp, precise knock rang out, the kind of knock that wasn't just a simple hello, but rather a declaration of authority. Jamal set the box down and opened the door. Standing before him was a woman in her early 60s, with carefully styled silver hair, a rigid posture, and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a neutral but unwelcoming expression. She wore a cream-colored blouse, pearl earrings, and a navy cardigan pinned with a gold emblem that read HOA. She didn't smile. "Good afternoon," she said crisply, her gaze sweeping over Jamal before flicking toward the moving truck like it personally offended her. Jamal straightened. "Afternoon. Can I help you?" The woman lifted her chin slightly. "I'm Margaret Lawson, president of the Fairview Hills Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally welcome you to the neighborhood and go over a few important matters regarding our community regulations." Jamal glanced at the thick stack of stapled papers she extended toward him. HOA guidelines was printed in bold across the top. He took them, flipping through the pages. Lawn maintenance, mailbox styles, trash bin placement, standard HOA nonsense. "Appreciate it," he said, about to set the packet on a nearby box when Margaret cleared her throat sharply. "We take pride in maintaining a certain aesthetic here," she continued, eyes flicking toward the moving truck, then his trash bins by the curb. "I assume that will be removed by this evening." Jamal glanced at the truck, then at Reggie, who was pulling a couch from the back. "It'll be gone when I'm done unpacking," Jamal said evenly. Margaret pressed her lips together in a tight line. "Good. And just so you're aware, Fairview Hills has strict waste management policies. Trash bins are not to be placed at the curb before 6 a.m. on collection day." "I noticed yours were already out last night," Jamal frowned. "That wasn't me. The previous owners must have left them out." Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. Then she nodded curtly. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her polished flats clicking against the pavement. Jamal exhaled slowly, watching as she crossed the street and disappeared behind her own immaculate front door. From behind him, Reggie let out a low whistle. "Damn, she pulled up on you like you stole something." Jamal smirked but didn't respond. He had expected some pushback, but Margaret Lawson wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was someone who wielded power. He had dealt with people like her before, gatekeepers, enforcers of unspoken rules, but he wasn't about to let her or anyone else dictate his place here. This was his home now, and he wasn't going anywhere. The first violation notice appeared 2 days after Margaret's visit. Jamal found it neatly folded in his mailbox, the HOA logo stamped at the top of the page. Lawn must be kept at regulation length. Grass exceeding 2.5 inches violates Fairview Hills HOA standards. Failure to comply may result in fines. Jamal stood on his porch, staring out at his lawn, which, if anything, was just as manicured as everyone else's. His landscaper had just trimmed it last week. Across the street, Mr. Holloway's yard was filled with wild patches of overgrown grass, but there were no violation tags on his door. No official letters taped to his mailbox. Shaking his head, Jamal crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. It wasn't the first sign that Margaret had an agenda. The second violation notice came the very next morning. Unauthorized vehicle in driveway. Vehicles must be parked in the garage or in an approved location per HOA guidelines. Jamal blinked in disbelief. The car in question, his own black BMW, the same one that had been parked in the driveway since the day he moved in. He took a slow walk through the neighborhood that afternoon. He counted 6 driveways with parked cars, no warnings, no notices. That's when he knew. Margaret wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was enforcing them on him, and only him. The third notice arrived at the end of the week. Exterior lighting must conform to HOA brightness regulations. Your porch light exceeds standard illumination. Jamal stood on his front steps that evening, staring at the same porch light the previous homeowners had used for years without issue. He scoffed and turned, looking down the street. At least a dozen houses had porch lights brighter than his, some with decorative string lights hanging year-round. Yet somehow, his was the problem. One evening, needing fresh air, Jamal decided to take a walk. As he strolled through the dimly lit sidewalks, he felt the weight of eyes on him. Conversations lowered to whispers as he passed. When he turned the corner near Diane Monroe's house, he heard them before he saw them. A small group of neighbors stood together in her driveway, chatting. Among them was Margaret Lawson, her arms crossed, her expression tight. Jamal stopped a few feet away, hidden behind the shadow of a large oak tree. He couldn't make out every word, but he heard enough. Just saying, "It's different now. We need to be careful about who's moving in." Margaret's voice, sharp and condescending. "But does he even own it?" A man's voice. Jamal thought it might be Ronald Pierce, the HOA vice president. "Exactly my concern." Margaret again. "I'll be handling it." Jamal felt his stomach tighten, handling it. He turned on his heel and walked back home. That was all the confirmation he needed. Margaret wasn't just a nosy HOA president. She was leading a quiet campaign to push him out. The knock on the door came the next morning. Jamal opened it to find Margaret standing stiffly on his porch, clipboard in hand, her usual tight-lipped smile firmly in place. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." Jamal crossed his arms. "Something I can help you with." Margaret took a step forward, holding out an official-looking document. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of homeownership." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." Margaret's voice was syrupy smooth, but there was an undercurrent of steel beneath it. "We've had some concerns." Jamal didn't bite. "From who?" Margaret ignored the question. Residents have noticed unusual activity, different cars coming and going. Furniture deliveries at odd hours. There's been speculation that you may be renting the property, which would be a violation of HOA regulations. Jamal let out a short, humorless laugh. You're kidding. Margaret didn't even flinch. Jamal took a slow breath, keeping his voice even. First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. Of course, there have been deliveries. I just moved in. And those different cars, that's friends and family visiting. You know, like normal people do. Margaret tilted her head, unimpressed. Well, we have procedures to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. Jamal's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this was. No other new homeowner in the neighborhood had been asked to submit proof of ownership, just him. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. You can pull the records yourself, he said flatly. It's public information. Margaret's eyes flashed. She hadn't expected that response. I'd prefer if you submitted it directly, she pressed. Jamal exhaled slowly, letting a small, sharp smile creep onto his face. And if I don't? Margaret's lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smile but held no warmth. Then I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the HOA board. Jamal's fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't give her the reaction she wanted. She wanted him to get angry, to raise his voice, to give her an excuse. Instead, he smiled calmly. I'll think about it. Then, before she could say another word, he closed the door in her face. That evening, Jamal saw her again. She stood at the end of his driveway, talking to Ronald Pierce, gesturing toward his house. Ronald scribbled something down on a notepad. Jamal didn't have to guess what was happening. Margaret wasn't just trying to make his life miserable. She was looking for a way to get rid of him. But if she thought he was just going to back down, she was in for a rude awakening. Jamal had enough. For 2 weeks, he had endured Margaret's relentless harassment. One violation notice after another, each more absurd than the last. His trash cans weren't pulled back fast enough. His car was an unauthorized vehicle, and his lawn was supposedly overgrown, despite being trimmed to the exact same length as his neighbors. It was clear now, this wasn't about HOA rules. This was about pushing him out. But Margaret had underestimated him. Jamal wasn't leaving. And now it was time to fight back. Jamal grabbed his phone and notebook, stepping outside into the cool Georgia air. If Margaret wanted to weaponize HOA rules against him, he was about to turn those same rules against her. He took his time, walking through the neighborhood, snapping photos. A house 3 doors down had weeds growing knee-high. Another driveway had an old pickup truck parked outside for weeks. No garage, no notice. A few houses still had Christmas lights up in the middle of April. One porch had faded, cracked paint, the kind of thing Margaret would have slapped him with a fine for immediately. Jamal took time-stamped photos of everything. If the HOA rules only applied to him, then it wasn't about community standards. It was discrimination, and he had proof. The following Monday, Jamal marched into the Fairview Hills HOA office, a thick folder of documentation in hand. The board meeting was already in session, and Margaret sat at the head of the table, her face tight with controlled smugness. Next to her sat Ronald Pierce, the HOA vice president, a man too comfortable in his privilege to even pretend to be fair. Jamal dropped the folder onto the table with a heavy thud. I'm here to file a formal complaint. Margaret's eyebrows barely twitched, but Ronald let out an exaggerated sigh. Mr. Hayes, we've already addressed your violations. Jamal cut him off. Oh, I'm not here about my violations. He flipped open the folder, spreading the photos across the table. Margaret's eyes darted over them, her lips pressing into a thin line. Overgrown lawns, cars parked in driveways, holiday decorations months overdue. Jamal's voice was calm but firm. None of these houses received violation notices, but I did. Ronald shifted in his seat. We review cases on an individual basis. That's convenient, Jamal interrupted, because I checked. Not a single other homeowner received fines for these same infractions. Silence. Margaret refused to look at him. Jamal leaned forward. I want an explanation. Ronald cleared his throat. The HOA board determines which violations require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice. Jamal scoffed. So mine do, but everyone else's don't. Margaret finally spoke, her voice cool and dismissive. If you're unhappy with our guidelines, Mr. Hayes, you're welcome to submit an appeal. Jamal smirked. I already did. And since I know that won't go anywhere, I'll be taking this to the county housing authority. Margaret stiffened. For the first time, she looked worried. Jamal gathered his paperwork, turned, and walked out. But he wasn't done. Jamal dialed Carlos Ramirez, his real estate attorney, as soon as he got back to his car. Carlos was ruthless in the courtroom, sharp as a blade, and twice as relentless as Margaret could ever be. The moment he answered, Jamal got straight to the point. Carlos, I need your help. I'm being targeted by my HOA. Carlos sighed. Tell me everything. Jamal ran through the details, the violation notices, the ignored complaints, Margaret's demand for proof of homeownership. Carlos was silent for a moment, then he chuckled. Oh, she's sloppy. Jamal raised an eyebrow. How so? She demanded proof of ownership, right? That's public record. If she wanted to check, she could have. The fact that she singled you out, that's discrimination. And if she's been enforcing rules selectively, that's abuse of authority. Jamal grinned. So what do? We file a formal complaint with the county, document everything, and make her regret ever messing with you. Jamal leaned back in his seat, smiling. Margaret thought she could bury him in bureaucracy. She had no idea he was about to bury her instead. The next morning, Jamal stepped outside to grab his newspaper and found a thick envelope in his mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a law firm. Frowning, he tore it open. His stomach tightened as he read the contents. Margaret had officially filed a complaint against him with the county housing authority. She accused him of being a fraudulent occupant. She claimed he had failed to provide proof of homeownership. She alleged that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about his presence in the neighborhood. No names, no actual evidence, just carefully worded baseless accusations. Jamal exhaled slowly. He knew what this was. She wasn't trying to get him evicted. She was trying to exhaust him, to bury him under legal paperwork, to make his life miserable enough that he'd just leave. But what she didn't know was that she had just played directly into his hands. Because now he had grounds for legal action. That evening, Jamal made a second phone call. Carlos picked up on the first ring. I need a counterattack, Carlos chuckled. Good, because I already started preparing one. Jamal grinned. Margaret thought she was winning. She had no idea what was coming for her. The air was thick with tension as Jamal entered the emergency HOA meeting that had been called by Margaret. The meeting had been scheduled in response to his recent legal actions, and Margaret was poised to make her move. She believed that with her fabricated complaints and false accusations, she had finally cornered him. But Jamal wasn't just going to sit back and take the heat. He had something far bigger up his sleeve. As Jamal walked into the room, he could feel the eyes of the HOA board members on him, the weight of their stares heavy and judgmental. The tension was palpable, and Margaret's smirk told him everything he needed to know. She thought she had won. Margaret had already positioned herself at the head of the table, her usual confidence radiating as she laid out her grievances against Jamal. Mr. Hayes has violated every rule and regulation of the Fairview Hills HOA, she declared in her calculated tone, addressing the board with exaggerated professionalism. And despite numerous attempts to get him to comply, he's ignored every reasonable request. Her words were sharp, each one like a knife aimed directly at Jamal. She glanced toward Ronald Pierce, who sat beside her, nodding along as if he was already convinced that Jamal would be ousted. Jamal, however, remained calm, almost too calm. He knew this wasn't going to be a standard confrontation. He had already gathered the documents that would tear Margaret's facade apart. After sitting down, Jamal smiled politely at the board members before he pulled out a folder full of papers. Papers that would prove Margaret's accusations were nothing more than lies. He placed the documents on the table for everyone to see. "I'd like to address your claims," Jamal said, his voice steady. "But first, I need to clear up some misunderstandings." Margaret's smirk faltered as she watched Jamal lay out the undeniable proof, his homeownership records. Jamal placed the official documents in front of the board. He had already done the homework, and his homeownership was beyond dispute. The record was in public archives, and Margaret's demand for proof was nothing but a false accusation to undermine him. "As you can see, I have clear ownership of my home," Jamal stated calmly, letting the silence hang in the room. "And as for your claims about me being a fraudulent occupant, there's no legal basis to it." Margaret's eyes flickered nervously, but she quickly regained her composure. "This is irrelevant," she retorted. "You've ignored HOA rules for months," Jamal cut her off. "Margaret, you're a hypocrite," he said, his voice laced with controlled anger. "You think you can push me out of this neighborhood with lies, but now the truth is coming out." The board members exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves. The atmosphere had shifted. Margaret wasn't the one in control anymore, but Jamal wasn't done. He leaned forward and spoke with calm authority. "I'm not just here to defend myself. I'm here to show you something far more interesting." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Jamal smiled and pulled out a second document. This one was from a property auction. "You see, Margaret," he continued, "I'm not just a homeowner here in Fairview Hills. I also happen to be the legal owner of your house." A stunned silence filled the room. Margaret gasped, her face draining of color as the implications of Jamal's words sank in. What do you mean?" Jamal's voice dropped, each word heavy with finality. "You failed to pay your HOA fees. You mismanaged your finances. Your home was foreclosed and sold at auction, and I, Mr. Hayes, purchased it." There it was. The ultimate twist. Jamal had just exposed Margaret's greatest weakness, her financial mismanagement, something she had worked so hard to conceal. He watched as Margaret struggled to process what had just been said. Her hands trembled, and for the first time she was speechless. Jamal stood tall, his posture firm and dignified, knowing he had just delivered a blow that would bring Margaret to her knees. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the board members processed the information. Ronald Pierce, who had once been a staunch ally of Margaret, looked uncomfortable. His eyes shifted from Jamal to Margaret, and for the first time, he seemed to hesitate. Margaret was no longer the confident, self-assured HOA president she had once been. Her power had crumbled. "You can't be serious," Margaret finally sputtered, still trying to regain control. "This isn't possible," but the evidence was undeniable. Jamal's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Margaret's growing panic. She knew her time at the top was over. The community had finally seen her for what she truly was, a fraud, hiding behind a facade of rules and regulations, using her position to bully and control others. And now she was exposed. Ronald Pierce was the first to speak. "I think we need to review this matter carefully," he said, his voice uncertain. It was clear that he was beginning to distance himself from Margaret, realizing that siding with her could bring unwanted consequences. Margaret's once secure grip on the HOA had slipped away, and she was left grasping at straws. Jamal, on the other hand, smiled inwardly, knowing this was just the beginning of his victory. For now, the HOA board had no choice but to halt their plans against him, as they had no legal basis to act. But Jamal's success didn't end there. He wasn't just going to let Margaret fall from power without making sure she faced the full consequences of her actions. She was going to be held accountable. Jamal Hayes sat in his sleek, modern office, the quiet hum of the air conditioning filling the space. It had been a few weeks since the emergency HOA meeting, since the moment he had completely shattered Margaret Lawson's grip on the neighborhood. The twists of fate had taken their course, and the world had shifted in his favor. The power that Margaret once wielded with ease had crumbled, and it was now Jamal's turn to walk in victory. But the struggle wasn't over yet. There were still loose ends to tie up, and Margaret, now desperate and stripped of her authority, was about to make one last play. Jamal had been expecting this visit, although he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. Margaret and her husband Walter Lawson arrived at his doorstep uninvited one chilly afternoon, their faces drawn with exhaustion and defeat. Margaret's once pristine demeanor was now a far cry from the confident, condescending woman who had ruled Fairview Hills with an iron fist. Her eyes were dark and puffy, the result of sleepless nights spent worrying about her financial collapse and the mounting pressure of the scandal. Walter, standing silently by her side, looked like a man who had already given up. His once proud posture was now hunched, as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. They had nowhere left to turn. "Jamal, we need to talk." Margaret's voice was weak, her usual sharpness nowhere to be found. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, dragging Walter along behind her. Jamal didn't say a word as they sat in front of him, the tension in the room almost palpable. He waited for Margaret to speak. "We're willing to make things right," Margaret said, her voice faltering slightly. "We want to buy the house back from you. We can't live with this disgrace anymore. We'll do whatever it takes." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly. He already knew where this was going. It was typical of someone like Margaret to think that money could solve everything, even after her lies and manipulations had caused so much turmoil in his life. He remained silent for a long moment, considering her words. How much was Margaret really willing to pay to get her old life back? Jamal leaned back in his chair and regarded Margaret and Walter with a calm, calculated expression. He could see the desperation in their eyes, and he could sense the urgency in their request. But he was not about to give them an easy out. "The house is valued at $500,000, Jamal said finally, his tone unwavering. "That's the price. Take it or leave it." Walter flinched at the number, his hands tightening into fists. He glanced at Margaret, but there was no hope in his eyes. Margaret, always the control freak, struggled to mask her shock. $500,000, she repeated almost incredulously. "That's outrageous. We can't afford that." Jamal didn't flinch. He had already anticipated their reaction. He knew that they didn't have the means to buy the house back, not after the foreclosure, not after the damage to their finances. He had decided long ago that he wouldn't give them an inch. After everything Margaret had done to undermine him, to make his life miserable, he would be remorseless in his decision. "Well, that's the price. You can try to find the money or you can leave." Jamal's voice was firm, and there was no room for negotiation. Margaret's face flushed with anger, but her words were defeated. "You don't have to do this." Jamal's expression softened ever so slightly. "I'm doing this because you need to understand what it feels like to be on the other side, to feel powerless, like I did when you attacked me. This is my way of leveling the playing field." Walter let out a heavy sigh, looking defeated. "We can't afford it, Margaret," he muttered. Margaret's prideful expression crumbled, and for a moment she was just a woman beaten by her own decisions. She glanced around the room as if trying to find some escape, but there was no way out. This was it. With no way to meet Jamal's price, Margaret and Walter were left with no choice but to move out. The next few days were filled with a final flurry of activity, as they packed up their things and prepared to leave Fairview Hills for good. Jamal watched from a distance as they loaded their belongings into a van, the once proud couple reduced to a shell of their former selves. It wasn't a moment of triumph for him. It was a moment of reflection. He couldn't deny that he felt some satisfaction, but there was something deeper at play here. He wasn't doing this just to see them suffer. He was doing it to send a message to everyone who thought they could get away with exploiting others. He was reclaiming his dignity and ensuring that the next person who tried to tear him down would think twice. The HOA board meeting that followed was a direct consequence of Jamal's actions. Margaret's fall from grace had been swift, and now it was official. She was no longer the president of the HOA. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position, acknowledging that her actions had damaged the reputation of Fairview Hills beyond repair. Ronald Pierce, who had once been Margaret's staunch ally, spoke out at the meeting, distancing himself from her completely. "The HOA is about community, not division," he stated firmly. "We must prioritize fairness and inclusivity." As the meeting wrapped up, Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was the justice he had fought for, and though he hadn't sought to destroy Margaret, her downfall had been a necessary consequence of her own actions. In the days following Margaret's departure, a few of the neighbors began to approach Jamal, neighbors who had kept their distance for months, too afraid to take a stand. These were the same people who had once turned their backs on him, who had stayed silent while Margaret's reign of terror took hold. But now, with Margaret gone, they no longer had the excuse of inaction. They felt guilty for having allowed the situation to escalate as far as it had. One such neighbor, Deanne Monroe, approached Jamal with an apology on her lips. "I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner," she said, her eyes full of regret. "I should have supported you. I should have seen what was going on." Jamal smiled politely, but he wasn't interested in hearing empty apologies. "It's all right," he said. "It's done. What matters now is that we move forward." And move forward they did. Though Jamal wasn't going to forget the challenges he'd faced, the future looked brighter. With each passing day, the neighborhood grew more welcoming. Fairview Hills was finally becoming the community it should have been from the start. As Margaret's house went up for sale, Jamal stood in front of it, looking at the sold sign that now hung in the window. This house, once the epicenter of hostility and division, was now just another house. Jamal thought back to the events that had led him here. The discrimination, the harassment, and the false accusations, they had all been an effort to break him, to push him out of a neighborhood where he had every right to be. But in the end, he had remained steadfast. True power, he had learned, wasn't about controlling others or using wealth and influence to crush those beneath you. True power came from knowing your worth, from standing up for yourself and refusing to back down. As he walked away from the house, Jamal felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had won, not because he had crushed Margaret, but because he had refused to let her break him. And that, he realized, was the true victory.